This group was started by my grandfather's eldest brother, whose name was Walchand, and he was actually quite an industrial pioneer and visionary. In the 40s, he was very keen to start automobile manufacturing in India. And in those days, General Motors and Ford were both already established in India. So he had no choice but to tie up with Chrysler because they were the only ones who were yet not present in India. He set up the company Premier Automobiles in 1944, and we entered into a license agreement with Chrysler Corporation to produce Dodge and Plymouth cars and trucks for the Indian market. The first vehicle rolled out in 1948. The early years were basically a CKD operation. We set up a Premier Automobiles Limited, set up a factory at Kurla, which is a suburb of Bombay. In those days, it used to be quite remote and sort of undeveloped area where we purchased about 90 acres of land and set up the first assembly plant. Post-independence in the sort of early 50s, there was a move towards having smaller cars, a sort of people's car. We discontinued our relationship with Chrysler and entered into a very long and fruitful and happy cooperation with Fiat. We started with the early versions of the Fiat Millicento, and eventually that became the brand in India. Premier Fiat 1100 was the individual owner's car, so it had a tremendous attraction to the average customer or the average consumer of automobiles in India. We positioned the Padmini as a value proposition, a sort of an executive car. Padmini is a name of a historical Indian Rajput princess. In the European version, if you called a car Princess Grace, it would be the same. That is the kind of comparison that the meaning Padmini had. In the early 60s, in fact, we were forced to localize 100% of the car because of foreign exchange constraints. As part of the mandated localization, we had to set up an entire press plant, which we did nearby in another suburb of Bombay called Kalyan. In 1968, Premier Padmini or Fiat 1100 became 100% locally made in India. So Premier and Hindustan Motors and Tatas, who were making trucks at that time, all had to develop virtually the component industry from ground up, and many of the big component players today were all essentially generated out of these two auto companies' needs. Then the car industry went through a very difficult period. We had constraints of foreign exchange. There was license control on production, on volumes, on new models. There was no permission given by the government to bring new upgraded technology. Also, there was a period of union militancy in India as a whole, but mainly in urban areas like Mumbai, Calcutta, where these plants were located. The result of that was that the car industry, both Hindustan Motors and Premier, suffered many years of financial difficulty. In the early 80s, at the time when Maruti Suzuki began and the famous people's car story began, we had approached Fiat, and they were interested in tying up for a new model car. And so we bought the body and technology of the Fiat 124, which we rechristened, because that time we did not have a license, to Premier 118 NE. Unfortunately, we needed to have a new engine. So in those days, we made a license agreement with Nissan. They gave us a very nice petrol engine, which we engineered locally to fit into this body, and sort of created a homegrown car using a Fiat body and a Nissan engine and a Premier engineering to integrate it. Altogether, that became a good success story in the Indian market. the early 90s, the entire economic situation in India changed, and the car industry was opened up and lots of global companies came in. So Premier also looked for joint ventures. Our first sort of port of call was Fiat, and I personally visited and made presentations, and Fiat was very, very excited to re-come together with Premier. Mr. Paolo Cantarella had just taken over as the CEO of Fiat Auto. So first step was to go with a license with Fiat Uno, and then evolve to the Fiat Palio family, which was developed by Fiat for Brazil and others. So we would also, India would also be a destination. But eventually we felt that going forward it made more sense to perhaps give the majority control to Fiat, and we remained as a minority partner, which eventually we finally completely exited. I'm not ashamed to say that Fiat's goodwill in India is a result of what Premier did for the car and the brand for so many years. The history goes that in the early days, mainly ambassadors were the taxis here, and the local taximen wanted a smaller car, more economical to run. So we started supplying taxis. I think very quickly they discovered that the Fiat 1100, which is the original car, was a very, very simple yet rugged and reliable design. It wasn't a simple car, but it was very simple to maintain and very rugged. And I think that became very attractive to the taximen. Because of that, the car picked up more and more by word of mouth, and soon virtually all the taxis in Mumbai were there. As Premier, we used to follow a policy. In fact, because most of the taxi owners in Mumbai are individuals, poor people who are working to make a living. So the company followed a little bit of a community service policy in this. We would offer the car at a lower price to the taxi market. The government also charged lesser taxes, and we would sell, in every month's production, maybe 10 or 15% to the taxi market. And over a period of many years, it virtually became the only car used. In the last 10 years, India has reached 2.3 million cars, and they expect this to double in the next 5 years. There will be tremendous need for high quality auto components. Today, Indian laws are such that Italians or foreigners can own 100% of the company. You don't need to necessarily have a partner. So local companies and brands and multinational brands can all find a place in this market, and I think it's a huge opportunity.